Hello, everyone here tonight. Nice to see you. Welcome to ICALA and to our Art Buzz. What? My ears. Art Buzz events happen on occasional Friday nights, and we do them to kick off a weekend with a little wine, with a little nosh, a little candy this time, and then we bring you lots of amazing. It's pretty great when we receive a proposal and it can be fitting for an Art Buzz here at ICLA. By the way, my name is Aska Hisa, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement. So, yeah, and so we receive these proposals, and we think, oh, this would make a great Art Buzz. And then next thing you know, there's an author, poet named Zefyr Lisowski with a fantastic new book, called Uncanny Valley Girls, essays on horror, survival, and love. We can applaud. And also a fantastic partner like Queer Art, an organization that cultivates a dynamic community of LGBTQ plus artists across generations and artistic disciplines. Please follow them and support them. All right. And then finally, a fantastic partner for conversation that is an award-winning writer, artist, musician, Johanna Hedva. Johanna kindly gave me this book, but please buy this book as well, which is How to Tell When We Will Die. Johanna. This is the award-winning book. And then it's great, how great that the timing of everything, schedules, make it possible to have a cool event at ICLA on Halloween. Look at you. I mean, thank you all for dressing up for the occasion. Alberto, us staff, everybody, it's just so fun. We should do this more often and all the time. Anyway, you're in for a treat, not a trick, or maybe, who knows. As Zefyr reads from the book, and Johanna interlocutates, and we get transported into learning how all of this got created. This event is co-organized with Queer Art, with special thanks to Lee Painter Kim and the other friends at Queer Art, Ria Segal, Rio Sofia, El Marman, Andreas Alvarez Bacchus, and also Edward, who is taking documentation, Nicole Sklitzis from HarperCollins for the books. You can purchase them tonight over there. And if you buy them here, it supports all of us. So I will admit to you that I'm not a watcher of horror movies, which is one of the themes in this evening's discussion, but I am open to change. And I'm currently being held in Zefyr's writing, which offers comforting perspectives on facing fear and finding love. So thank you all for coming. Your presence is a great support and a great comfort. And I want to have Ria come over and say a few words on behalf of Queer Art, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll keep my words brief because Asuka gave such a lovely introduction, but it's so sweet to be here. I run programs at Queer Art, which is a small organization that Asuka very kindly described. We are based in New York City, but serve queer and trans artists nationally, and it's a rare treasure for us to get to participate in programs outside of New York. So I'm really delighted to be here and to see y'all. Please follow us on social media, newsletter, etc. But we're about to enter the 15th year of kind of our anchor program, which is the Queer Art Mentorship program, which pairs emerging and established queer and trans artists for a year of sort of transformative relationship building and community building to support practicing artists across literature, visual art, film, and performance. And as we enter this year, it's like nice to sort of look towards a new new horizon of doing programming more nationally to support the artists where they're at, not just in New York City. We have such a wonderful community of artists here in LA, and I'm really excited to get to know more of you. So thanks so much to the ICA LA for inviting us to share space here. And it is my great pleasure to invite the incomparable Zefyr Lisowski up to the stage to read from her book.
I'm going to start at the podium just because I have a stomach applique on and I want to make sure everyone can see it at the start of the event. I'm not sure, here, let me just hold this in my hand. I'm not sure who's seen Crimes of the Future, but I'm Femboy Saul Tensor from the movie. If you've seen it, maybe that resonates. If not, you're out of luck. I'm going to read the opening chapter of this book, and then I'm so excited to be in conversation with Johanna, whose work I love and respect so much. Thank you so much for everyone for being here. I'm good sound-wise, right? I'm kind of a soft speaker. Okay, perfect. Preparing to enter the psych ward, my nerves swelled, and all I could think about was you. The you who broke up with me a week ago, the you who I would break up with in 7 months, and the you who would visit me 2 months later. My body ached for you like the surgeon's hand aches for the scalpel, like the butcher knife aches for meat. In the selfie I took then, my eyes were red from crying. To distract myself, I watched Scream on my laptop in the emergency room as I waited to be admitted. It was my go-to comfort movie. At a time where I couldn't feel further from it, it reminded me of home. Throughout the whole period of my confinement, Scream and movies like it were how I rerouted my fear into something more manageable. Whenever I'd stare into my reflection in the shatterproof mirror bolted to the wall, I'd tell myself I was scared of a hunting knife piercing through my aorta, not the murkier dangers I feared lurking within myself. Whenever I'd drink, to calm my nerves, the water was the warmth and thickness of blood. This is a book about horror, real and filmic, which means it must also be a book about love. For those of us who live in power's periphery, trans, disabled, non-white, poor, love happens under violence's shadow. But love also happens despite these violences, not through them. A love preceded and succeeded by separate horrors is no less a love. In fact, you have to have love to begin with in order to fear it being taken away. So when I talk about horror and about love, I can't not talk about the hurt, or the rapes, or the deaths, or the moments, quivering and dripping blood, before I entered the ward. I can't not talk about the way the scary movies I saw shaped me, and how I bent that shape until it became something new and gleaming. These movies, their alternate hatred and empathy, their pathologized and victimized women, their strength, resonated with me even from a young age, and the fact of that uneasy allegiance scared and nauseated me. I experienced things I couldn't control while watching scary movies. In the tightening of my chest, I felt even more open to the lives these films depicted, lives like my own. To watch a scary movie, after all, is to surrender yourself to the impulses of your body, the extremity of shock or fear overriding all other emotions. Through this surrendering, I believe, you open yourself to other experiences more complicated, learn to name the quieter desires peeking through the rough shawl of fear. Besides, repulsion, one of the foremost responses to horror, is mainly a mark of recognition. I see myself in this, and I'm scared. And I also believe anything you can see yourself in so intimately can be turned into a kind of care. People, even people who have not been broken, if such a thing exists, love horror films. People love horror increasingly more every year, in fact. Between 2012 and 2021, scary movies went from taking up about 2% of the annual American box office to 13%. There's a well-worn pop science explanation for this rise. Scary movies, we're told, serve as a controlled release for people craving adrenaline, same as roller coasters. The increase in horror's popularity, the argument goes, speaks to the increased need to relieve stress. The genre, scholars say, thrills without threatening. Horror movies conjure fear without the danger concurrent to fear, and in this way present an escape from the quotidian struggles of the viewer's lives. Horror shows lives unlike our own, and this is where it gets its strength. To make this argument, however, is to falsely attest that the lives in horror films are unlike our own, and I learned to love through the ways I saw myself reflected, not pushed away. Despite the ghosts or curses or spree killings, scary movies are ultimately about the weight of violence on a life. They're about the ways to keep living despite a whole world that wants you dead, and the legacy of that survival, the part of you that have given up on surviving. They're about moving or failing to move towards care despite being irreconcilably hurt. But they aren't escapist. At least, they weren't for me. Like Scream, they showed me the possibility of a place filled with beauty and pain in equal measure. They showed me how to identify a hurt before I even knew how to name my own. Horror, the French feminist psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva writes, is rooted in the truth of our lives. And truth, she says, is a barren side without makeup, without seeming, rotten and dead, full of discomfort and sickness. Horror uses the idea of weakness as a cudgel, inverting its terms. The weak, the rotting are actually strong and will overcome us, and through that, fear is generated. Horror, Kristeva argues, is driven by need but unconcerned with propriety, womanly, but not always a woman. It's rooted in embracing and rejecting the feminine to equal degrees. In that sense, every horror movie is about girls and what's done to us. I have lived passionately again and again. I am covered in passion's pockmarks. Horror movies became an obsession because they were about a similar survival in the face of unbearable pain. The girls who survived and the girls who wielded that pain bore the same marks I did. As I walked up and down the ward, my own scars hardening and burns began to scab across my body, I understood why these movies, good movies and bad movies, schlocky films and petrifying ones, meant so much to me. It's as important to look back and track the hurt, these films tell us, as it is to dream of a more hopeful future. Besides, it's only through tracking back that we can remember the kernels of care that make life and scary films more tolerable too. A whispered "I love you" between friends, the wind whipping through your hair when biking from party to party in the moonlit night, a day in which nothing happens at all. When Kristeva wrote her 1980 study on horror and objection, Powers of Horror, she was looking to find a way to purify that objection. That was her language, to purify. Art, she felt, was the most total way to do that, and according to her, the purest forms of art made the abject beautiful. Abject art, she argues, is based in death, the root of all horror. Death purifies us too, she says, and in doing so, establishes a secular religion. But to purify is to sanitize, and to sanitize is to exterminate, which brings us back to death all over again, from the other side. Even as she engages with the abject, Kristeva uses the language of eugenics. She views horror from her position on high, looking down from the seat of power. Because of this, I love her work, but know her work will never love me. So I have to find my own way to understand the way death, the uncanny, and the horrifying have shaped our lives. Horror movies are about death, yes, but death itself is about the life lived beforehand, the choices and connections made before an exit, the place before the fear begins. Another word for Kristeva's sickness, after all, is vulnerability, and vulnerability always lurks beneath the surface of horror, the wound beneath the stitch. Horror movies are about staying alive, and that focus has taught me more about care than anything else. Through them, after all, you can see everything in a life: atmosphere and pain and death, and above all, the desire to keep living. And in who you watch horror with, because few people I know watch scary movies alone, you can see the rest of it too: the sex and guilt and grief and everything else that goes into loving yourself and others. I thought of each of my past relationships and of the movies we watched and the ways we reached for each other and the things that wounded us. Leatherface sawing through his leg in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, your finger tightening against my pinky on your beat-up couch. A sea of faceless women in Antichrist, neither of us touching the other's body yet, the clock almost midnight. For many of these movies, there's nothing scarier than those peripheral to power, embracing their own power anyway, queer or trans or othered bodies finding kinship with ourselves. As we watched countless films showing us both as unspeakable monsters and survivors, we felt held by the hatred and power alike. The miraculous thing about a wound, after all, is not our capacity to heal. Many wounds do no such thing. The miracle is our capacity to live and love despite this wounding. In the psych ward, I walked the halls. I read, and I wrote, transcribing my experience as much as I could. Notebook open, thinking about the relationships, flings, and breakups that brought me there. I scribbled, "This is a story of love. This is also a story of loss." But I was also thinking about myself. I just couldn't name it yet. I closed the notebook and stepped outside my room to walk the halls again. Above, the fluorescence buzzed, a wasp's nest. "You are safe," I whispered to myself and other new companions there, until it almost felt true. To be afraid is to care deeply about whatever you're afraid of, or, to be more succinct, to be afraid is to care. Scary movies, I believe, can teach you how to live. They can show you the lives you've already led. They can promise what a new horizon looks like. They're how I survived. When I watched Scream in the emergency room, I had seen it at least 4 times already. I'm sure that's part of why I watched it, why it felt like home. Even on that first watch, the violences felt familiar, the snark comforting, the characters understandable in their fear. I watched it, and I texted you, who I would break up with soon. "I'm okay," I said. "I'm glad I'm here." After the credits started to roll, I closed the laptop, gathered my things, and sat down into the wheelchair that was thrust before me, a requirement to enter the ward as a patient. As the elevator took me up, I thumbed over to that text again, drafting a follow-up I would never send. Instead, I paced the walls, white masks flashing behind every corner, every pang toward self-harm a red knife. I was starting to realize that our relationship needed to end, and as I walked, I thought about how much that scared me too. It stretched out before me like a set of intestines. It left my body like blood. I don't want to write a life without viscera, or rewrite any pain endured as less intense than it was. It would be dishonest to both my life and the lives of those I love. So yes, I was right in the word. This is a story of loss, and this is also a story of love. And both, the horrors are ceaseless. In fact, it's all the same story. The horrors are how I found myself. So let's begin there. I promise, at the end, it will all shape into care. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Happy Halloween, everybody. Happy Samhain. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So good to be here as well.
It's so fun. I'm going to sometimes take off my Azami Spiral Girl from Junji Ito's Uzumaki glasses so that I won't feel sick. But I thought it was a little bit like fitting that my costume should make me suffer a little bit tonight.
I mean, that's the spirit of horror, right?
Definitely.
That make you feel bad.
Yes, this is a great place to start. I'm also so happy that you read this section that you read, because so many of the things that are in it, I feel like one of the reasons why it's such a great first chapter is that they just start to branch into the rest of the book. And a lot of my notes are really just exclamation pointed phrases. So I thought, in keeping with the spirit of tonight being Halloween, I wanted to start with this quote that I loved from the very end of the book, but maybe we can go from the beginning through it. At the end, you say it's easy to have community with ghosts because they're everywhere. And I thought, because of Halloween, Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, Samhain, there's a feeling tonight of being in community with ghosts and the dead. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about this, especially for those who haven't read the book yet, about the ghosts that you're in community with in the book. There are many personal ones, political ones, and there's this kind of very vibrant, it feels like you're inviting us to this really fun party, nocturnal, maybe a witch's Sabbath, lots of things getting raised from the dead in your book. So I was wondering if we could start there.
Yeah, so happy to. It's a kind of bring your own cauldron sort of situation.
Yeah.
The book's really concerned with a number of specters, right? It's thinking through the legacy of being, part of it is thinking through the legacy of being an American, being a white American in the 21st century, which is a life marked by almost ceaseless violences and sort of murders and superstructural erasures that are generating these ghosts constantly, right? Like, especially growing up in the South, there's so much violence that goes into creating the South as we understand it. And I was really interested in talking about that, talking about the racial dynamics of the place, talking about the class dynamics of the place, talking about the indigenous erasure that you have throughout all of that. But also, I was interested in ghosts on a personal level as well. I am very much alive because of a sort of spectral haunting, which I talk about in the book. My older sister, when she was 19, died in a car accident, and then 2 years later, almost to the day of her death day, I was born. And very much her absence became this kind of contour that my life filled in around that I talk about in the book. But because of that, I always had, even from conception, this situation and this feeling of being haunted in a way that I think has really served as a complex force in my life, but also a generator of empathy and of sort of kinship with the dead, with those who are existing in liminal experiences of aliveness. And that's one of the things I really love about scary movies as well. It's kind of a cliche to say that scary movies are about grief, but so much of them are. They're about grief, and they're about the legacies of violence. And I think those are two of the defining questions of being human.
Yeah, because the like feeling that you evoke in many of the essays, I loved reading this book. I read it in the winter. It says here on my galley, finished on February 11th, 2025. You sort of are in various levels of depth with your conversations with different hauntings and ghosts. There's these sorts of, different sorts of othernesses. It's like, sorry if I'm not being articulate yet. There's sickness, there's disability, there's transness, there's queerness, there's being poor, there's being victimized and abused. There's all of these sorts of like kind of ways in which and then you reflect this into the movies, like you carry these kind of weights that are invisible and yet highly visible. which is something that it just strikes me as like the ghost is such a perfect metaphor for those of us who can see them. They're everywhere, but then, you know, they're invisible according to a certain normative read of society, right? So I loved the way that you kind of immediately bring us into this place that's populated by ghosts that are scary, ghosts that we might not want to invite into our homes or lives, and yet they're there anyway. So I think, like, just as a starting point also with this idea of like building community, it's so interesting to me that the way you begin this book is in the psych ward, and then you end it at an artist residency. Can you talk also a little bit about this kind of these different ways that community and being haunted by the absence of community or wanting something from a community that's not yet there or is used to be there, or there's a kind of specter of it that you wish were still there, like this kind of way of like reaching, almost slouching toward a community, and then also the interplay of being kind of alone or haunted by this absence?
Yeah, that's a really phenomenal question. I think one of the animating concerns of this book is sort of what we do with others. And the way I talk about it is I say it's a book about being scared around exes. And like various, I mean, there are like 4 major relationships that are kind of thought through in the book. So it is a book about exes, but it's...
And in your acknowledgments, you like have a lovely line about the exes.
Which actually, this is like maybe getting into interpersonal gossip. It changed for the final... Well, no, it's in the final version too.
Okay,
There's
great.
a different lovely line about the exes in the final version.
Okay, I live because when I went from my hardcover to my paperback, I like the only change I made was to delete one of the X's from the acknowledgments. I was like, delete.
I love that. Yeah, no, I removed the names because I was like, okay, this is a little bit like touchy, but I kept the sentiment. So there's still some deletions happening. They're haunting the text now. They're seen but not seen. But it's really important for me to like start in the psych ward because it's this place that we kind of normatively think of as this nadir, right? As a space of like total aloneness, of total desolation. And psych wards are like complicated and roughly speaking bad places. They're like deeply carceral. But there's also so much community and connection that I found there, primarily with other people who were confined in the ward, who I don't talk as much about in the book, but also through these relations that I was developing and reevaluating with the outside world. And part of the reason I was interested in starting the book with a psych ward and ending it with a residency was to think about these 2 ways of clustering people that are actually similar in very significant ways. You know, you have like set meal times, you have sort of this both privacy and this hyper visibility, and you're there to work on something, right? You're either there to work on writing a book or you're there to work on getting out, but you leave at the end, hopefully, regardless. And having that juxtaposition was really important to me, kind of underline that this is, as you mentioned, a book about loneliness, but also a book about community.
Yeah, you have a great paragraph in, you know, just sort of like comparing the artist residency to the psych ward and how similar they are. Slightly better food, hopefully, in the artist residency, but, you know, maybe not. I really enjoyed starting in the psych ward because I've been in the psych ward more than once. And most of the time when you see a psych ward set the scene for a book, you're in, you know, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest territory. It's pathologized, it's miserable, it's a horror movie in and of itself. You know, the actual human beings that are in this place, they don't really live as humans. So I wanted to like use this as a segue into my next note that says identity, oh no. Because I love this complication that you're doing in every essay about the sort of problem that horror movies make pleasurable, which is like we identify with the villain, we recognize ourselves in the monster, There are all of these ways that the thing that we're supposed to be afraid of, like you say in the beginning chapter that you read, we actually feel a kind of witnessed by or recognition through. That's really important to how we formulate our understanding of ourselves, our families, our, socioeconomic and political and historical kind of forces that are acted upon us. Like all of these things that come together to make us who we are. The way horror kind of traffics in them is like it's supposed to freak you out, but then you end up kind of relating to it all. And this is a tension that you work with in so many interesting ways. You talk about, your relationship to the South and watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre, your relationship to Black Swan, and like the artist who can only realize her project by dying. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this, I want to twin this, the problem and the pleasure of identity that you do in this book.
Yeah, I think that's a problem and pleasure that you see in a lot of existing criticism around horror as well, right? We often see this model where you watch horror movies because you're like, oh, bad things have happened to me. And go watch a film where bad things happen to someone else and feel kind of vicarious release. And that's powerful, right? And then you also have this approach where it's like, oh, people kind of view me in these bigoted or these otherizing frameworks. I go watch a movie where a monster is empowered through those acts of otherness, and I'm going to feel strength through that. And that's also powerful. But what I haven't seen as much discussion of is the ways in which horror can also act as a reflection of complicity and violence and the kind of complicated actions that we all engage in that are perhaps less admirable or less sort of prideful. And I think that's one of the things that's the most powerful things about horror is, what if you watch something and you identify with someone who is an othered figure and is also doing bad things? And how does that cause you to think about your own relationship to yourself? Because the other thing around identity is around all these axes of identity, right? Disabled identity, queer identity, trans identity, all of these things that I kind of share that have been marked onto me. It's really boring to kind of insist on your own virtue, right? I really am actually pretty adamant that if we want to make any progress at all, and if we want to make anything worth making, we have to acknowledge the way that we, who have been hurt by systems of power, also are capable of hurting. And as I was writing this, that was one of the things that I was really interested in doing, which I maybe do most explicitly in the werewolf essay, which we can perhaps talk about. But yeah, I mean, what thoughts do you have?
Well, I had the pleasure of reading with you in New York City in April for a Glitz fundraiser, and you read an excerpt. Can we talk about it?
Oh, yeah.
Of your new project, the lesbian werewolf love story.
It's
erotica.
Yeah.
It was so great.
I think I read an excerpt where a main character goes to the woods and gets fucked by a bear.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So
it was so good.
Yeah, some fans in the audience, some conceptual fans in the audience, I see. Yeah, I love werewolves, right? I think there's kind of a capaciousness to them. And that like every werewolf story is about having a transformation, having a thing happen to you that you don't want to happen. And at the end of the movie, because werewolves are also like almost exclusively a medium like that we see in film. Like everything we associate with the werewolf mythology was pretty much invented in 1941 by this American, Polish-American Jewish screenwriter Kurt Smiadak with The Wolfman, which is this 1941 movie. That's where the silver bullet comes from. That's where the 3-day moon cycle comes from. Before that, it was just libel used in witch trials, basically. So they have this very particular history that is much more recent than other like monsters, which I find fascinating. But also, I think we see in this corpus of werewolf story someone who doesn't like this thing is happening to them. And then the conflict that you see in every werewolf movie or every werewolf story is, what do you do when it keeps happening anyway? And I think that's also a deeply human question, and it raises these questions of autonomy and also raises questions of the erotic, right? Yeah. Like, how do you have things done to you, and what do you do with the wake of that? I know we talked in New York for your paperback book launch about traumatophilia, yes. Which I think is really relevant to how I'm approaching both the werewolf essay in this book and the novel as well, thinking about legacies of sort of repeating violence in a more containerized way to kind of heal from it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can try to, the idea of traumatophilia is this very exciting development that I'm really invested in. It's basically like psychoanalytic theory trying to catch up, mm-hmm. Trying to make itself in practice much more supportive of people of color, queer and trans people. Because this is one of the things, right, that's happening in a lot of horror films, especially, even today, but especially, the 20th century classics, the villains are, the worst thing that, can happen to you is to become disabled. Mm-hmm. The villains are trans, they're deviant, they're doing violence because of their, otherness. And I think that that's something that gets very complicated for those of us who have these identities, and the question of agency within that identity, the question of desiring it. This is something that traumatophilia, I think, in psychoanalytic theory is trying to account for, is that sometimes your trauma, or maybe always, it's not going to go away or get fixed, or you're going to return to a pre-traumatized state. Instead, and it's also not going to get managed in necessarily a really, convenient for capitalism way. So there's something about what to do with an approach to psychoanalysis or psychological therapy that would not be afraid of trauma and would not try to transform it into a curative model, right? But to actually what happens if you love your trauma and you keep it close, which I think is something that you bring up again and again in all of these ways. And I might say in your book, what's really amazing is how much the erotic and the pleasure kind of registers are going on all the time. Mm. You're just such a sensual writer. And I think, one of the things I'm going to skip ahead to my notes is that you're a poet.
Right.
Can we talk about how good of a poet you are?
Oh my God. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I got my formal training as poetry. My first love is poetry, and there's so much that a poem can do that I'm constantly in awe of. And I think one of those things is sort of acting as a container and a conduit for the sensuality of emotion. And that's something that even in my prose, I really sort of strive to aspire towards, right? To think about, maybe it's also my chart. I have 5 placements.
So many things in Pisces.
So much things in Pisces. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 5 or 6 placements in Pisces. I have a full stellium, which for those of you who aren't familiar with astrology, who somehow showed up here anyway, means I'm a very emotional person, which is also why I like horror movies, right? Because they're exercises in feeling. Fundamentally, if you're watching a horror movie and it's working, you're feeling something.
Yeah, can I just say about the poetry thing, I made a note for every time you use the word purple as a verb. I loved it. It's more than 5 times. And when it first happened, I was like, oh, purple is a verb. And then it happened again, and I was like, oh. Mm-hmm. And then when you did it a third time, I underlined it, and I was like, third time. It's one of her words.
keeps going.
I
There's a lot of bruising in the book.
There's so much
so much bruising.
It's bruised, it's wound, it's like all of the, and I wanted to actually, this is just like a talking shop. It's maybe not such a highfalutin question, but going from poetry to prose, I was just curious, like, what do you think of your sentences doing differently? Because I have like my way of kind of trying to move between genre and like the ways that it gets me to write differently. And I was just curious, like, because also this is your debut essay collection after 2 books of poetry. Like, what was the process just in terms of writing, craft style, like different between the projects?
Yeah. Well, I think just briefly to kind of think about what's changed, there were elements of prose that both of my poetry books also engaged with. My first book was a book of sort of persona poems from the perspective of Lizzie Borden, and I kind of thought of it as a novella in verse. So it follows this sort of mainly non-fictional but embellished structure that follows a kind of narrative arc as the book goes on. For those of you who don't know, Lizzie Borden, wealthy, white, New England resident, lesbian, like probable lesbian at the turn of the 20th century, who murdered her father and stepmother with an axe in the middle of the day and then got acquitted. So the book became an exploration of being a bad bitch, but also the complexities of that.
And the movie's pretty good.
I don't mind the movie.
I like the movie.
There's an essay about Lizzie Borden in the book too, for those of you who haven't read. And then my second book, Girl Work, is composed in the unit of the sentence. So I was already starting to think about like, what can a sentence do? And as I was writing this, I was starting to think not about sentences, but about paragraphs. And that has a different rhythm, right? There's ways in which a paragraph that's full of long sentences moves slower than a paragraph that's full of short sentences. And sometimes as I was composing, I was like, okay, I'm going to alternate the length of sentences to have a more kind of conventional flow. But I was also interested in these moments of, there's like a passage in like the main psych ward essay, Crazy in Love, that was very much written in these kind of like the depths of this relationship that was consumptive. And as I was writing it, I was really interested in like having these long flowing sentences that were winding into each other that didn't quite have like endpoints until you reach the psych ward, and then you do. That's the endpoint. So I was drawing from poetic techniques, and I was reading a lot of poetry as I was writing the book as well. A couple of lodestars. June Jordan is a writer who I always return to, who I think does really incredible things with a kind of directness of language that I aspire to, but also more kind of like other poets who are thornier in other ways as well. Alice Notley's Descent of Alette is a book that means a lot to me and does weird things with ghosts as well, to return to your first question.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that came to mind when I was reading it also was that you kind of do this thing that I think, well, I'm always very impressed when a writer can, so to speak, move the camera around without me noticing. I have this little thing that I talk about with my students, that I just want to feel like I'm reading, not that I'm reading writing. Mm. And one thing that I think that you do really well, and it starts to affect almost like a simulacrum of a horror movie, is you move the camera in and out, like into the body, outside of the body, into the house, outside of the house, into the, kind of embodied problem, and then outside how society is like interpreting that. There's this real like kind of, it's a scale shift, but it's also like an interior-exterior thing. And it just kept me thinking about this adage, of horror movies, that the call is coming from inside the house. This is what I said in the blurb, but I really started to think it, that like, you're the sort of person that would answer the phone and be like, hello, who are you? Like, tell me everything. I've got time, Mm-hmm. And so there was something about this that I wanted to like just ask you, like, how did you because there's a restlessness almost to the camera that then feels very sensual and graceful and explorative.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you, I mean, maybe it's just like your superpower, but is it something that you think about when you're writing, like how to move around in a paragraph or a scene?
Absolutely. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, firstly, because I'm a habitual phone answerer and caller as well. I've gotten in trouble for just calling people in response to text messages, which is something that I like no longer do as much, but I do sometimes. But I think as I was writing this, I was really interested in canons of and tropes of horror films and how to represent those on the page as well in structural terms. So there are all of these, many of these essays have trick endings, right? They have this sense of false resolution, and then you're like, oh, actually, these problems, these traumas, these fears, these tensions actually continue. And I was really interested in sort of using that as a technique to think about the ways in which horror films, as I say in the first essay, can provide a mirror, can provide a reflection. And what are these things that are often derided as gimmicks, right? Like the Friday the 13th ending where you have like baby Jason lunging out of the water. What happens if we start thinking of these not as gimmicks, but as devices towards a greater understanding of ourselves and of others? And that was one way that I started to think about the camera, but there are other things as well.
I love that. Yeah, the other thing that I was like thinking about is here on my is, and you talk about it a little bit in the excerpt that you read for us, but I mean, I hate to bring Kant into the room, but you know, there's this idea about beauty, that you know what beauty is based on what revolts you, or what you think is ugly. That the way that we understand what we think is aesthetically pleasing is by viscerally understanding what we think is not. And so I was wondering if we could like almost make a dialectic. Oh no! I know, not to bring the Hegel and the Kant into the room. But almost this like thing that you're setting up, that like to be repulsed is to learn how to love, or to be horrified is to learn how to care. Like these kinds of things, I love putting them together, even though we've probably been taught that they're binaries that should never be put together. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like this kind of how you kind of move in these relationships of these things that seemingly are opposite or contradictory.
Of course. Well, I mean, part of it is returning to this question of identity, right? Like as a trans woman, I occupy a position that's both alternately and simultaneously an object of intense disgust and intense eroticism. And those two things kind of overlap over each other, like slide transparencies, right? You have both of those responses in the kind of hegemonic public in ways that, you know, like all of the like most virulent transphobes are like pretty notoriously and pretty famously huge chasers as well. There's like this eros that's running underneath this revulsion. And I think especially having that life experience kind of broke down the barrier between the two a little bit. But I'm also interested in disgust as a mode of intimacy, right? In myself, if I feel grossed out by something, I view it as an sort of instruction to look closer, to see what's there, and what happens if you push through to the other side. What's the disgust covering up? Because often it's either something about yourself that you don't want to sort of acknowledge or fully see, or it's something about, it's a moment of recognition, or it's a moment of desire. And thinking through those things was really important to the kind of fundamental arc of the book. And it's also something that you kind of learn in a psych ward. It's like a gross place.
Yeah. No, I also thought about this a lot in this sensuality and the erotics that you really lean into, that I'm a pervert and a sadomasochist, and so like just all the leaking and the stains and stuff was like, to me, part of the erotics that you're doing in this book, that's like register you're tapping into, of the viscera being a place for connection, intimacy, like you're saying, vulnerability. love.
I mean, I'm so glad you're picking up on all of that because this is a sad book. It's a book about like grief and loss, but it's also a book about connection and it's a book about intimacy and erotics. And like one of the arguments that is making that not as many people have picked up, maybe because the freak contingent of the book's readers are a little bit quieter right now, is that it's for whatever reason. But it is like a book about like erotics, and it's a book about being like a freak and being a pervert and having these complex desires as well. That's just a little bit, it's the layer underneath the layer.
But what you're doing that very rarely happens is you're doing that, and there isn't a pathologizing or a self-pathologizing happening at all. And I think that might be difficult for, like, you know, whoever this general reading public is that our, you know, publishers expect of us to write for. There's a kind of, I mean, this is in my book as well. There's an entire section on kink in a book about disability, which was really like a hard thing to try to sell.
Yeah.
And I wonder about, because those who know, you know, there's, like, of course, this is what the book is doing. Of course, there's a book about, or a section about kink and a book about disability. Of course, there's wounds and leaks and stains and smells and breakdowns in a book about love and care from the perspective that you're writing it. So I guess, like, yeah, there's some, I mean, what I really appreciated about this is that you just kind of don't let yourself off the hook, but at the same time, you're not self-pathologizing and you're not punitive. You have a really relentless kind of insight project, but there's never like this kind of, maybe it's like an absence of shame or something. You can tell when a writer has shame what they're writing about, you know, and that's not what's going on here at all.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm reading a book right now whose title will go undisclosed for the sake of sort of professional, because it's recording, exactly. But I'm reading a book right now which is like kind of rooted in a subculture, and I'm not at the end, but I could tell that it's arcing towards the person emerging into traditional society. And I know it's really sad to see it coming, but there's also, I think maybe because I grew up so Catholic, the shame is something that I'm like, okay, I've sort of been through this. This is such a sort of intrinsic part of me that I actually am not interested in seeing it in the art that I make or consume. Which isn't to say there can't be, and I think if you ignore shame, there are like more complicated questions. Like, have you seen the movie In My Skin by chance?
Is that not the Almodovar one, the other one?
It's the French, no, there are three ones. There's The Skin I Live In, which is the Almodovar film. There's Under the Skin, which is where Scarlett Johansson is a alien who can assume every identity but still looks like Scarlett Johansson.
Yes, and which I watched alone. I mean, you said people don't watch horror movies alone, but I watched that alone in an empty cabin in the woods at night.
Oh my God.
I know.
That's a conversation in and of itself. But there's this other movie called In My Skin that I saw after I completed this book, unfortunately. Otherwise, there'd absolutely be a chapter on it in here. It's one of the most singular movies I've seen in like a very long time. It's this film by this director, writer, star called Maria Devan, named Maria Devan. And what the movie is it's about a woman who suffers an accidental injury at a party, and things escalate to the point where she becomes an autoerotic cannibal. Which is already interesting, right? But part of what I find so fascinating about it is this movie comes out, it's like a kind of unusually like sensual film. There's this like incredible sequence where she checks herself into a hotel room alone and just starts eating herself. But there's this interview that she was given in 2018, 15 years after the movie came out. And in the interview, they're like, okay, this is such a complex metaphor. There's so much that this can stand in for. It can stand in for kink. It can stand in for self-harm. There's a read that you can make where it's about this kind of latent queerness. How were you able to come up with this like really subtle, really multifaceted metaphor? And she just says point blank in the interview, it's not a metaphor. I was sort of erotically eating myself for years, and I made this movie to stop. And I know. And there's so much there, right? And it's moving beyond an experience of shame into thinking about, like, okay, how do you deal with questions of embodiment? How do you deal with questions of perverse desire, right? What are the ways in which, if you ignore just this is bad, what's left? And I think the questions that are remaining are so much more fascinating and so much more relevant to both the life that I'm interested in living and lives that I think haven't been seen reflected as much as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is just like, I'll get to my final question from here, but like this idea of traumatophilia that we're bringing up has this sort of, like it's almost like a way of retraining the analyst, or the therapist to let trauma actually kind of. Most therapists are trained that if you start to cry, most people are trained that if you start to cry or you start to feel a kind of state of overwhelm or you're like kind of reliving a trauma, the idea would be to like kind of manage it and make it okay and actually order it into something representationally legible. And traumatophilia is like, no, you can let it be opaque, you can let it be enigmatic, you can let it not be reparative. And there is something about that that's like coursing through all of this, right? That's like, you can just want to eat yourself erotically and like, period, full stop. We don't need to explain why. We can just sort of sit in whatever erotics or radical present that engenders. And then if it makes further social, relational connections, how interesting, right? Mm-hmm. I think maybe to wrap up before we take your questions, if you have any, I just have movie talk on my notes. We're Letterboxd friends. And I was going to ask if you want to share your top 4. This is what the Letterboxd community is like all about.
I'm so happy to. My top 4, surprisingly contentious. It is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original 1974 movie, which I sort of write about in this book as being my favorite film. The Cook, the Wife, the Thief, and Her Lover, which is a phenomenal movie if you haven't seen it. Also deals with sort of desire in the absence of shame, I think is like one of its main animating concerns. Lady Vengeance by Park Chan-wook, which I'm obsessed with, is like one of the most insightful films about vengeance and kind of about the erotics of vengeance that I've ever seen. And then Ponyo. What about yourself?
Oh my God. The Handmaiden.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Also, Park Chan-wook.
Yeah, I feel like all top 4 for me are Park Chan-wook. The Handmaiden, Sunset Boulevard, because I'm from LA. And I'm just really like living my best Norma Desmond life. Moonstruck. My parents got me a VHS of Moonstruck when I was 9 as my birthday present, and I like watched it over and over and over. And then honestly, in my letterbox, I have this in my top 4. I've only seen it once. I was so blown away. It's called Neptune Frost. It's Saul Williams and Anicia, his wife's film. And I've only seen it once, but I was so moved by it. Every element of it, every frame, the score, the costumes, like it really, really was like indelible for me. Even though there are many that I could put in there that I've seen a dozen times that I adore, but I put Neptune Frost in there. Okay. Questions from you? Anybody? You have to speak into the microphone because of the recording. So just raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone.
I also should say, since this is an intimate book, if you have an intimate question, you can whisper it in my ear at the signing table, and I'll quietly give you a response in turn.
I would definitely take up that offer if I were you.
Thank you so much for this really beautiful, rigorous conversation. It's been an absolute delight. And I'm really sorry that I was late. I had therapy. But yeah.
Also relevant.
Right. And I'm sorry if you already said this, but what was your first encounter with a horror film? And was it activating in like a mostly like a largely was it like love at first sight basically, or was it something where it was something that you cultivated over time, the relationship with horror?
Okay, that's a really great question, and there's a complex answer to it. As far back as I can remember, I was really into sort of these old black and white Universal monster movies from like the 20s and 30s and 40s. They were an early fixation on me. The Wolfman is one that I write about in the book. But my first experience with a horror movie where I was like, I'm not sure about this, I don't discuss here. And that was when I was maybe 5 or 6. I wanted to rent from our local Blockbuster the like 1920s Phantom of the Opera, the like silent movie. And as a mistake, I rented a 1980s hard R slasher remake starring Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger. And I started watching this movie and I got so scared. And my mom, in a piece of maybe bad parenting that has like permanently affected my life, said, you have to finish watching it. Whatever you imagine is worse than what will actually happen. And the next scene was a woman being like skinned alive and strung into a closet. So I had nightmares about my closet for months, which is ironic now, I realize. But afterwards, that kind of put me off actual scary movies for quite a while. And it wasn't until The Ring, which I write about in the book as well, where I watched this, I get so scared by it, and I start, when I was in maybe 5th or 6th grade, and I start really unpacking, okay, what is it that's so scary about me? What's so scary about me? Yeah, yikes. What's so scary about this movie? And that became a way to kind of think through these larger questions of horror and identity more broadly as well. Also, this is Diana Artarian, who edited my poetry collection. Girl work, phenomenal editor and poet as well. So I just wanted to shout that out for the stream. Any other questions?
Hi. So I've always been a hater of horror films, and I think recently I've had friends kind of pull me, yourself included, into being more interested in them. One of the things that I've not liked about them is that there's usually dumb people are like the main characters, or maybe I'm projecting, but I'm like, you see them making decisions and you're like, don't do that, and they do it anyway, right? And I think the scary thing for me about them and why I've been put off is that I'm afraid that I might be that person, making me think about something you said earlier about, I mean, you said, and being adamant of your own virtue. And I think that's something that repulsed me about horror films, is like maybe I have been adamant about my own virtue, that I'm like smarter than the normal people in the film who like go into the basement or like, you know, open the door or whatever it is. I was wondering if you could talk about like that strain or through line in horror films of like the monster being the smart one and the characters being like fallible or like gullible.
Yeah, that's a really phenomenal question. I think that there's a dialectic, right, where there's both, it's kind of both, right? One of the reasons I love Texas Chainsaw so much is that, like, in addition to all of these complex things around disability that you see in the movie, there are like 2 familial structures in Texas Chainsaw, the like protagonist and the antagonists, and both of them have these like disabled siblings who they fucking hate, in a way that like kind of creates bridges of empathy between the 2 families. That like one of the tragedies of the movie is that there's never this point of connection, because Leatherface, who's developmentally disabled, is sort of being forced by his familial structure to dispatch these teenagers, and these teenagers who have a disabled brother, who they hate, sort of just like summarily discard him. But I bring this up because there's this scene in Texas Chainsaw that I'm obsessed with, which is these kids keep just going to this random house full of people who want to kill them. And they keep like going to the house like one after another, like ants almost. And there's this shot where you see Leatherface looking out the window, and he's like killed like 2 or 3 teenagers at this point. And then he sees another one coming, and he just goes. And I think that actually horror films have this really interesting thing that they do, where there are these moments of fallibility that you see in both villains and protagonists alike. Scream is another great example. The like killer in Scream is constantly tripping all over the place. He's incredibly clumsy, and that kind of makes it scarier because it makes it seem not that he's just the smart one, but that he's human as well. So I'm actually kind of pushing back against your question. I think maybe a certain genre of horror film has really invulnerable, smart, empowered antagonist and really kind of clueless protagonists. But that's not the short film that I'm the most captured by. I think there's so much more that goes on in the genre that complicates that as well.
I have a question just about, and I haven't read the book yet, so I have to apologize if you talk about this, but I'm interested to hear more about like class and just like these relationships between like horror movie and like form. Like you talk a lot about like, you know, these like operatic sort of like, you know, horror movies, but then we also talk about these kind of like kitschy, corny, trashy things in terms of like form and then also like narrative and concept. Can you talk a little bit more about class dynamics?
Yeah, so just to clarify, thinking about the ways in which like the high-low divide of horror connects to larger questions of class, especially in the US.
Totally.
I think that there is a kind of distaste that you sometimes see with horror films because they're visceral, embodied experiences, and there's a kind of refinement that we can sometimes see with like the art house, for instance, where there's a kind of like clinical, like crisp detachment. One of the reasons why I hate Black Swan so much, which is a movie I talk about really actively disliking, is because there's a kind of almost sadism that the director, I feel, holds the characters in, where it's like sort of so removed from their lives, it becomes farce or it becomes metaphor, but doesn't actually think about the sort of life lived. And with my own experience, I grew up middle class in the rural South, which is such a particular classed experience, right? I grew up being like, oh, I have these friends who are like far wealthier than I am. And then I had this realization in high school where it's like, oh, I'm actually more similar to them than I'm not. I have to like confront this positionality. And then I moved to New York and I started being actually rich people. And I was like, whoa, there's like such a difference between our worlds. And I think that very particularity, especially in the South, there's so much around class, so much around race, so much around gender that all kind of exists in more concealable ways, especially in the Northeast, that really gets pushed to the surface in the American South. And I'm really grateful for the ways in which those things kind of became foregrounded because, and that's one of the things I love about horror as well, because it is about class. To return to like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a group of wealthy yuppies going to the home of people who have been disenfranchised and laid off slaughterhouse workers. It's a movie that's about, in addition to being about disability, in addition to being about gender, which is a whole other conversation that we can have, it's very much about the realities of class. And I think that horror is one of the genres of American film that confronts that the most directly and is one of the things I find the most powerful about it as well.
agree. I wanted to just chime in and say there's a really great essay that I reread every couple of years by Colson Whitehead called My Animatronic Childhood. And it's about growing up Black in New York City and like religiously every weekend going to like the Blockbuster with his brother and just getting like a stack of the trashiest horror movies. Like B movie, like really, really like gory and kind of cheap special effects and makeup. And he writes this sort of amazing memoir of how that made him understand racism as a child, but then it kind of gets into the second level of understanding what it requires to be an artist. It's such a great essay. The other thing that strikes me when you're talking about like growing up in the rural South, there's a lot about this book. I don't know, we never talked about it, but have you read Leela Taylor's Darkly?
I have, yes. I love that book.
Yeah, I love this book too. It was like Leela Taylor wrote a book called Darkly, America's Gothic Soul, and it's about growing up. I mean, she's like the only Black kid at the Bauhaus concert in the late 80s. And she writes this kind of blend of memoir and cultural criticism around Gothic, the Gothic in relationship to America, because normally we would think of the Gothic as being a kind of Victorian English, you know, white women in nightgowns running through their mansions at night, you know. But Leela Taylor writes about, but like in America, the specter haunting this country is chattel slavery, and that the ghosts of the South are sort of everywhere. But it just occurred to me when I was listening to you talk about that, that book seems to be, you know, kind of one of the community of ghosts that you're writing with.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. I actually just got invited to be on a panel with Leela Taylor, and I'm like so excited about it. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm a little bit like, what am I going to say? But yeah, I think that's a really astute point and one that's made really well in that book. It also sort of causes me to think about Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? Which is, in addition to being one of, if not the defining novel of the second half of the 20th century, in America certainly, is both a Gothic and also a horror story. It's a ghost story. It's about haunting, literal and metaphorical, in ways that I think are really important to emphasize.
Yeah, and Leela Taylor does an amazing, she writes about Beloved, and she also writes about the work of M. Lamar, who's an avant-garde opera singer who has coined the term the Negro Gothic for the work that he does. He's incredible. But she puts Beloved in conversation with M. Lamar, which I thought was amazing.
Absolutely.
Last question? Yes, you.
Oh, amazing. All right. I think I'll be quick. You guys are amazing. This is wonderful. I have a list because I'm wearing vampire teeth, but bear with me.
Disability and horror.
There's a movie I detest called Antichrist, Lars von Trier. I can't handle none of it because I think it sets up a myopic moral universe and then follows through with the to the vanishing point of essentially enabling moral decrepitude. I feel like it's the most limited of type of filmmaking, but it's also horrific, right? Castration, child death, and all of that. Marital strife as horror. So it reminded me. Recently, I was rereading Anne Eaton's essay about Titian's The Rape of Europa. And she makes the argument that she's a philosopher of art. She makes the argument that Titian enables moral decrepitude, essentially enables rape fantasies through the depiction of, because it's really chill. Like, we're all on board with that painting because we're so used to naked women being abducted especially by sexy beasts. And then, little angels having their gaze fixated on the girl's vagina in the painting. We take it for granted. It's normalized. And she thinks that something's horribly wrong and horribly broken in the moral universe of a painter who wants to do that, right? And I think that that's also an issue with Antichrist, the movie. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about these things.
There's
because
a
I'm
whole
just
chapter.
there is.
The longest chapter in the book. Which is, probably 60
I've
pages
never
long.
seen the book. Yeah.
It's totally fine. It's about how much I love Antichrist as a feminist text. So I love this as a question to go out on. And I think fundamentally, thank you so much for this.
It's a possession.
I think it raises a question of identity and point of identity and point of identification specifically. I think Antichrist, which is a movie about a man who murders his wife. That's what the movie is about. I think it becomes an incredibly different movie depending on whose vantage point you watch it from. If you watch it from the man's vantage point, it's a horrifying, really misogynistic film. But if you watch it and identify with the woman, I find it an incredibly affecting movie about the way that consent is generated for irredeemable acts. And I find that incredibly resonant and incredibly important to consider. I think for me, one of the, and I think this is like a larger question, right? Part of why I don't like Black Swan is because I view it as kind of having this palliative kind of sadistic impulse, this like sadistic parentheses, derogatory impulse to sort of see a woman punished. And I think the way I view Antichrist, especially the ending, which features, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, I'm going to spoil the ending, but it features Willem Dafoe has murdered his wife, Charlotte Gainsbourg, not literally in the universe of the movie, but he's murdered his wife and he burns her body on a pyre, kind of a la like the witch burnings that the film is obsessed with. And then he sees all of these women kind of walking in unison up a hill and their faces are blank. And to me, I view that as an expression of a community and of a kinship and a connection that fundamentally he cannot understand and can never access because of the violence he's done. And that completely shifts the context of the movie for me. I think that's my interpretation, but that's one of the things I find the most exciting about horror as well, and that there's a way to view these really depictions of heinous acts as being an expression of care, community, loss, and what we do with violence, which I think is not just one of the defining questions of the genre, but as one of the defining questions of being a human in general.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I'll be over at the signing table if anyone wants a book signed or picked up. But thank you so much for coming here.